Now let us talk about imagination. What is imagination? Coleridge refers to a simplistic power of the imagination. A simplistic spelling Esplastic. A simplistic power of imagination. A simplistic meaning shaping into one. A simplistic power is intuitive, unitive faculty that sees the whole behind the parts, the one behind the many, where reason analyzes and reduces into parts. Imagination puts the parts back together into a whole and takes us to the hidden metaphysical unity behind multiplicity. Behind multiplicity. This is very, very important. Imagination puts the parts back together into a whole, WHOLE, into a whole, and takes us to the hidden metaphysical unity behind multiplicity. How Coleridge tries to explain imagination. He writes, imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. Imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite. Finite means human being. Repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite. Imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind, in the mind of human being. Repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite. Infinite means divine, God Almighty. I am. A-M. I am. The secondary I consider, here he makes distinction between primary imagination and secondary imagination. The secondary imagination I consider as an echo of the former, that is primary imagination, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary imagination in the kind of its agency and differing only in degree. Try to understand how he is making comparison between primary imagination and secondary imagination and in the mode of its operations. Secondary imagination dissolves. Important. Secondary imagination dissolves, diffuses and dissipates in order to recreate, or where the process is rendered impossible. Yet, still at all events, it struggles to idealize and to unify. It is essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. So let us explain each part of this explanation. So I'll explain each part of this long explanation given by Coleridge. So what does he say? The imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. Coleridge is introducing the concept of imagination and stating that he will be discussing two types of imagination, primary imagination and secondary imagination. What does he say later? The primary imagination I hold to be living power and prime agent of all human perception. Primary imagination, Coleridge refers to the fundamental, innate and essential aspect of imagination. Try to understand what does he mean by primary imagination. Primary imagination, St. Coleridge refers to the fundamental, innate, essential aspect of imagination. Living power. He mentions living power. Coleridge suggests that this imagination is dynamic. Living power means it's dynamic, vital, and energizing. It is dynamic, vital, and energizing. Then he says prime agent. This is the prime agent. Primary imagination is the prime agent. It means the primary imagination is the main driver or force behind human perception. It is the force behind human perception. Of all human perceptions indicates that primary imagination is responsible for shaping our understanding and experience of the world. So try to understand how primary imagination is also very important it because it is responsible for shaping our understanding and experience of the world. And as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Repetition implies mirroring or echoing of the divine creative act. Divine creative act. It implies mirroring or echoing of the divine creative act. Finite mind refers to the human mind, limited by its finite nature. Eternal act of creation suggests a continuous, timeless process of creation. In the infinite I am refers to the divine, infinite, and eternal aspect of God or the universe. Then second part of this explanation, the secondary imagination I consider as an echo of the former. Secondary imagination is lesser, derivative aspect of imagination. Echo implies a fainter secondary reflection of the primary imagination, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency. Coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary imagination in the kind of its agency. Coexisting suggests that secondary imagination works alongside conscious will. Conscious will, this is important. Secondary imagination involves voluntary act. Identical with the primary implies that secondary imagination shares the same fundamental nature as primary imagination. In the kind of its agency means that both imagination types, means primary and secondary, operate in a similar way and differing only in degree and in the modes of its operation. Differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation means that secondary imagination is not fundamentally different, just less intense. Mode of operation refers to the way secondary imagination works, which differs from primary imagination. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. This verb describes the secondary imagination's process. What does secondary imagination does? It dissolves, breaks down existing ideas. Diffuses means spreads and disperses them. And dissipates means disperses. Dissipate means disperse and scatter them. Dissolves, breaks down existing ideas. Diffuses means spreads and disperses them. And dissipates means disperses and scatter them. In order to recreate suggests that this process aims to recreate or reassemble ideas into new form. This is very, very important as far as secondary imagination is concerned. In order to recreate, it means its aim is to recreate or reassemble ideas into new forms, or where this process is rendered impossible. Yet, still at all events, it suggests to idealize and to unify. This is last part of this explanation. Where this process is rendered impossible suggests limitation or constraints. Struggles implies persistent effort. To idealize means to strive for perfection or an ideal form. To unify means to bring together different elements into a cohesive whole. It is essentially vital even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. Essentially vital emphasizes the dynamic living nature of secondary imagination, even as contrast with objects. All objects refers to things perceived as static entities, fixed entities. Essentially fixed and dead highlights the contrast between the dynamic imagination and the static objects. So in this way I have explained each part of the explanation given by St. Coleridge. We can distinguish between primary and secondary imagination in bullet points. So primary imagination and secondary imagination. You see, I am talking about primary imagination now. So primary imagination, St. Coleridge says, is fundamental, innate and essential. So Coleridge says primary imagination is fundamental, innate and essential. Mirrors the divine infinite means God, mirrors the divine infinite act of creation. Endless, infinite here means endless act of creation, eternal act of creation by God. Primary imagination shapes human experience and understanding. Primary imagination is dynamic, it is vital and energizing. Primary imagination is fundamental, innate and essential. It is the foundation or basis of human perception and experience. It is present from birth, an inherent part of human nature. It is crucial and necessary for human experience. It is crucial and necessary for human existence, making it a vital component of our being. Making it a vital component of our being. Second point, it mirrors the divine infinite act of creation. It means primary imagination reflects or echoes the divine creative power. It refers to the ultimate, transcendent and sacred source of creation. Infinite act of creation means a boundless, endless and eternal process of creation. Third point, it shapes human experience and understanding. Primary imagination forms, molds and influences human experience. Human experience encompasses our perceptions, emotions, thoughts and interaction. And understanding refers to our comprehension and interpretation of the world. Comprehension and interpretation of the world. The next point is dynamic, vital and energizing. Primary imagination is dynamic, vital and energizing. It means that primary imagination is active, moving and forceful. It is essential for life, energizing and sustaining human existence. Primary imagination infuses human experience with energy and power. And the last point under primary imagination is it is raw, unrefined and unconscious. So primary imagination is unprocessed. Try to understand the basic difference between primary and secondary imagination. Primary imagination is unprocessed, unfiltered and unedited. It is not polished, refined or cultivated. It is involuntary act. It is involuntary act. Unconscious means involuntary. It operates beneath the level of conscious awareness. It operates instinctively and intuitively. So these phrases collectively describe primary imagination as fundamental, innate and essential aspect of human nature, which mirrors the divine creative power, shapes our human experience. It is dynamic and vital, yet operates in raw, unrefined and unconscious manner. Coming to the secondary imagination. Secondary imagination, S.T. Coleridge says, is superior, refined, and sophisticated. Secondary imagination is considered superior because it builds upon the foundation of primary imagination. It refines and perfects ideas. It is sophisticated. It means sophisticated means it is complex and nuanced, and refined. It means it is polished and cultured. So, secondary imagination builds upon the foundation of primary imagination. This is important arguments that S.T. Coleridge makes as far as secondary imagination, and therefore he said that secondary imagination is superior to primary imagination. Next, secondary imagination transforms and idealizes existing ideas. Secondary imagination takes existing concepts and transforms them into something new. Secondary imagination idealizes. It means it strives for perfection and makes ideas more beautiful, elegant, and refined. Secondary imagination, S.T. Coleridge says, is conscious, deliberate, and creative. Secondary imagination operates at a conscious level, meaning we are aware of its workings. It is deliberate. It means we intentionally use it, and it is creative. It means it generates new ideas and possibilities. Secondary imagination, next point, takes the raw material of experience and shapes them into something new and meaningful. Secondary imagination works with the raw data of our experiences and shapes them into coherent, meaningful concepts. It is like crafting a work of art from raw material, and therefore secondary imagination is more important than primary imagination. The next point is secondary imagination struggles to unify and perfect, and even in the face of limitation. Secondary imagination strives to bring disparate, different elements together, creating unity and coherence. It seeks perfection, even when faced with constraints or limitation, despite constraints or limitation, and drives us to improve and refine our ideas. This explanation highlights secondary imagination's role in refining, transforming, and perfecting ideas, making it a powerful tool for creative expression and problem solving. So primary imagination is raw and unconscious, while secondary imagination is refined and conscious. Primary imagination shapes human experience, while secondary imagination transforms and idealizes that experience. Primary imagination is dynamic and vital, but secondary imagination is more sophisticated and creative. In this view, primary imagination thus primary imagination lays the groundwork for human experience, while secondary imagination takes that experience and elevates it to new heights through its transformative and idealizing power. And therefore, secondary imagination, according to S.T. Coleridge, is superior to primary imagination.